Welcome to the Democracy's College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. This is the first of 2 episodes where Chaddrick Gallaway from OCCRL talks with James Felton III, Chief Diversity Officer at SUNY Cortland, and Michele Smith, Associate Provost and Special Assistant to the President for Diversity and Inclusion at William Rainey Harper College, about Chief Diversity Officers in Higher Education.
Hello, my name is Chaddrick Gallaway with the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, and today I am joined by James Felton III, Chief Diversity Officer at SUNY Cortland, and Michele Smith, Vice President of Workforce Solutions and Associate Provost for Curriculum at William Rainey Harper College. And today we'll be having a brief conversation about Chief Diversity Officers in higher education. So with that said, we're going to jump right into the podcast, right into the conversation. Thank you, Michele and James, for joining me today. Jump right into the first question. The literature on institutional diversity and campus climate is largely focused on 4-year institutions. Can you share what issues related to diversity matters and campus climate are present at community colleges?
Sure, I'll take the lead on that one. First, I'd like to say thank you, Chaddrick, for inviting us to be a part of this podcast. We're thinking about issues of institutional diversity and campus climate at 2-year institutions. Obviously, we want to particularly focus on the transient nature of community college students. We find that those are obviously non-traditional students, first-generation students, and so there are issues around access, and particularly as open access institutions, meeting students where they are. And the campus climate about that is trying to find out who they are in terms of their sense of identity and purpose in life, and how that meshes with the institutional culture of the particular community college campus. I think the completion or issues of completion are another issue, particularly that are addressed at the community college level when we're looking at campus climate. You know, again, for students who are first generation, they may not know how to navigate the college process or familiar on what a college level course is, looking at credits and degree plans, as well as career exploration. And so that completion agenda is definitely, I think, more prominent at the 2-year level versus the 4-year level. And then I think I just mentioned it, but again, social capital is extremely important. And, you know, the social capital is the idea or the notion that social networks are central, they're transactional, and they're marked by levels of reciprocity, cooperation, and trust between one or more groups. And so, again, as we have lots of different students or types of different students coming before the 2-year colleges or institutions, really helping them navigate, again, that sense of identity, who they are and who they are in relation to others, and what does that look like in terms of their own personal achievement, completion, and success.
Yeah, and you know, Chaddrick, I agree with James. First of all, thank you as well for this opportunity to talk about this really important and relevant issue at the community colleges now in terms of diversity and equity and issues of inclusion. I think, to James's point, the issues around changing demographics, and not only race and ethnicity, but as our students change in terms of age, what they come to us with in terms of prior learning experience and looking for credit for that, socioeconomic status. We're seeing a higher number of students that are Pell eligible these days, and then first generation students. So I think all of those matters of diversity are impacting the community college landscape, and the chief diversity officer in these spaces have to be ready to respond to those varying needs. And you have to find ways to get it done so that the students who are coming to us, often looking to earn certificates or credentials in ways that work with the rest of their life. They're working, they may be parents, they may be pursuing other interests. So not only is there the diversity of the students that you're adjusting to, but it's also in the different ways we might deliver instruction. What do we do in terms of online or blended formats? And then the other thing I think, and it's probably really recently this year, that's impacting issues around diversity and inclusion are this conversation around free speech versus hate speech and the distinction between the two. And I don't know that community colleges expected to be faced with these issues at the rapid rate and the frequency at which we're seeing them show up on our campuses these days.
Can you say more about that free speech versus hate speech? I'm sorry, I'm going off the script here a little bit, but I'm interested in that. Can you say more about, I guess, the issues that community colleges or chief diversity officers are facing around that?
Yeah, I think that what has happened a little bit more as we look even at the political landscape in the last 12 months, 16 months or so, there seems to be a movement where people, and some of this started, I would argue, as social media got on the rise, where people feel a lot more comfortable saying what they really think when they really think it. And I think those conversations are bleeding over into community college campuses. I think where students are walking into classrooms and seeing anti-Semitic symbols on walls in classrooms or in bathrooms, or speakers coming to campus because public institutions typically have free speech guidelines. But if I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan or some other hate organization, how does a campus respond to, we promote free speech, yet the speech that's being promoted is hateful and marginalizing and sometimes terrorizing to the student body, which we serve, which is very diverse. So chief diversity officers are being called into those conversations and being asked, what do we do? How do we continue to honor the First Amendment for everyone? But also, how do we create a safe space for our students in the midst of what some may label as hate speech, when others may say it's really just a matter of free speech? I don't know that we have legal definitions of that, but I don't know that we have a person definition of how we do that effectively, continue to honor being public institutions and open to everyone, but also helping our students and staff not to feel afraid in the midst of these narratives.
Thank you for that. But before we move on to the next question, James, did you have anything to say about that in particular, the free speech, hate speech on campuses, community college campuses, or four-year campuses in general?
The only thing I would add to what Michele said is looking at the topic of free speech in democratic terms versus the free speech terms, because I think when we look at it from a democratic perspective, then we have an opportunity to engage both sides of the coin, if you will, in terms of those who are in favor of the issues and those who are opposed to the issues. And I think what we've done for too long is, and what higher education has been attacked for, is that we take on sometimes an overly liberal approach to looking at these issues. And again, as we think about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to provide those spaces for all voices, whether they're voices we agree with or not. And so I think, having democratic, deliberate debates and dialogues where people can have opportunities to engage in a discussion that's thoughtful and educationally appropriate around these issues versus being reactive to controversial speakers or the message they're trying to spew it in and of itself.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So moving on, community colleges, kind of what we have been talking about already, are among some of the most culturally pluralistic post-secondary institutions given their vast, diverse student population. However, the role of chief diversity officer in higher education, mainly in two-year institutions, is a newer role. Beyond changing student demographics, what do you think accounts for the growth in CDOs, chief diversity officers, and community colleges? And what impact do you feel CDOs can influence college culture?
In the academy, we have taken the community colleges for granted for many years in terms of that culturally pluralistic demographic of our society. I think we're now at a point in the current landscape of our country where we no longer can just sit back and be spectators to the changing demographics. We have to, as one of my former presidents used to say, you're either going to be at the table or on the menu. And so in terms of directing the policies and the practices and procedures around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to be at a point where we're not being mandated or forced to do this work. And we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. But we also understand the impact that it has on our institutions. And I would say that we understand the impact that it has for the changing demographics of our students, and particularly community college students. And so I would say, gone are the days when higher education could simply just say, we're here to provide a service of imparting knowledge and provide you with a diploma. We have outside influences and global influences now that we have to take into account in preparing the growing and changing needs of our students and our population in our world. And so I think that has promoted, an uptick in the presence of chief diversity officers at the community college level, because again, making sure that we have a seat at the table and that these issues are, one, relevant, but two, intentional, and creating, this presence or notion of inclusive excellence that permeates throughout not only the campus culture, but our policies, our institutional practices, and how those impact our daily interaction in our workforce, as well as our academic community with our faculty and our students.
Chaddrick, I just want to add a little bit there. I think James makes such a good point about this being at the table conversation. If nothing else, that chief diversity officer at our community colleges is about being at the table. So as a member of the C-suite, you often see the chief financial officer sitting at that table, the chief information officer sitting at that table. And so what does that mean? That means issues around the financial health of the institution are front of mind. When the chief information officer is sitting at that table, issues around the technological infrastructure of the institution are front of mind. They're your chief HR officer, et cetera. When the CDO is sitting at that table, we now make issues around inclusion and equity and diversity for our changing demographic of students. They now become front of mind at that table. And so they are not secondary, they are not afterthoughts, they are actually a part of the main menu, if you will. So I think that is really, if nothing else, a key point for why these CDO roles, as they continue to increase, are so vital and being a part of that C-suite. So they are part of the natural conversation and a part of the natural conversation around the holistic health of the organization or the institution.
Absolutely, and I guess one follow up to that, I guess I want to ask is, should there be just one chief diversity officer or just one CDO, or do you see like a team of CDOs across campus in these like C-suite meetings, or I guess what would you like to see in terms of the CDO role moving forward? Where like now we might only have one chief diversity officer at the table, but would you like to see more or multiple, or maybe everyone in that C-suite that's at that table have like a chief diversity officer mindset or focus? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ultimate goal to doing this work is that there isn't a need for a chief diversity officer. Certainly we are not at that point, and definitely with our current landscape of cultural and social and political climate that's happening globally, there's definitely a need to have some strategic diversity leadership at our institutions who, again, are focused on this. I think that it depends on the institution and what the needs of the institution is and the type of institution it is in terms of whether you have one CDO or several CDOs. I think that you have to be mindful of the type of work that person is being asked to do. There are some institutions where it may be important to focus more on a student experience. There are other institutions where it may be important to focus on the employee experience around diversity, equity, inclusion. And so one of the things that we've been informed by our work as professional colleagues over the last couple of years is this publication by the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, or NADHE for short. And they published in 2014 a list of professional standards for chief diversity officers. And so this list is in no ways, to be an end-all, be-all for every chief diversity officer, but it does give some credence and some credibility to the day-to-day responsibilities of the work that we do. And that's one way to, I think, figure out what are the needs of each individual campus, and particularly at the community college level. I think it's relative to size. I think it's relative to locale, whether you're rural or urban. There may be more pressing needs in terms of whether you need to focus on issues of compliance, employee engagement, curriculum, and what have you. I don't know if you want to add to that, Michele.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that James's point about in the perfect world, we wouldn't need just one person to focus on issues around inclusion and and equity. I think that is the utopia we'd all like to get to. So in some ways that lends itself to the narrative that everybody should kind of have some skin in the game. But I think that comes with issues around accountability. Mm-hmm. What resources are you given to the Chief Diversity Officer? How are your leaders held accountable to being a part of the solution and not part of the problem? What expectations do we have on our workforce, on our various institutions to being a part of making students from various backgrounds feel welcome and included? I think that kind of grows that mindset because it really is a culture shift for many institutions. You know, as the reality of it is higher education in and of itself was not really designed for those that are historically underrepresented in the system, which is why they are historically underrepresented in the system.
That's right.
And so in order to change that dynamic, we've got to begin to change the thinking. And oftentimes you do that by shifting where people are held accountable. That helps them to start to wake up and see that they need to do things differently. And so hopefully you get to a place where this is natural to the work that everyone does in terms of it not having to be one person's responsibility.
And one thing that I want to, I guess, peel back for our listeners who all may not be well versed in the position of Chief Diversity Officer or the literature on Chief Diversity Officer, which kind of goes back to something that James recently said. In terms of the Chief Diversity Officer, James, a minute ago you said that they can focus on faculty, they can focus on staff, they can focus on students. Just for our listeners, in what ways do you, James, or Michele, in what ways do Chief Diversity Officers work with these different groups of people on campus as far as like staff, students, faculty? Just really quickly for our readers, or not readers, listeners.
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I think one of the things that James and I, and then Clyde Wilson-Pickett, our co-author on the book that we authored together, one of the things that we came to the reality of as we got to know each other attending conferences and realizing we have the same job titles, but we were doing very different work at our institutions, is that different institutions have different needs. So and when I served in the Chief Diversity Officer role, it was really a very much an employee-facing role. So the job was really about kind of where are we as an institution, as employees, around bias and issues of underrepresentation. What are our unconscious bias that we are carrying? What do our policies look like? How welcoming do we make our campus feel? We've had some major shifts in the socioeconomic status of the students that were enrolling at our campus really quick in a 10-year period. What adjustments have we made to that? So we did a lot of introspection, retrospection, forming employee resource groups, forming mentoring environments for one another, putting in accountability measures, very employee focused. And I would say that Clyde would argue his work was very compliance focused, Title IX, EEOC, and James can speak to the work that he was doing, but when we first talked, a lot of it was more student and community focused. So there's this idea that I always argue that the way different institutions need different types of presidents, depending on what season they're in, I would argue the same holds true for your Chief Diversity Officer. Your campus may need a different type of Chief Diversity Officer and a different focus depending on what season and where they are on the spectrum in their growth.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to making it work in terms of looking at the skill set of the Chief Diversity Officer, you know, what is their background in higher education? You know, when these positions started, people were picked because they simply looked the part. And so having a sophistication and being well learned in strategic diversity initiatives on your campus, I think helps to advance the work and the agenda of the CDO. And then I think what also makes it work, I think Stephen Covey once, said that speed happens, or that transformation and change happens at the speed of trust. And so, we have to be strategic initiators, we have to be diplomats, we have to be collaborators. So those NADHE standards really give some insight, I think, in terms of the work that needs to be done primarily by the CDO, but then how do you use that knowledge, that sophistication, that skill set to then create transformational change on your campus? And you have to do that working with the various entities at your institution.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for all the side questions. I will try to get back on script here. Um,
No problem.
so you both recently co-authored an article entitled "The Chief Diversity Officer's Going Presence at Two-Year Colleges," published in Insight into Diversity. In the article, you state that a sense of belonging is important in the persistence of students of color to degree completion. How can chief diversity officers create a campus environment that fosters a sense of community, belonging, and connectedness for students of marginalized racial identities within the community college context?
So, Chadrick, one of the things for me that sticks out about that, and part of the reason we included it in the article, is there has been a lot of work. Vincent Tinto did a lot of work around belongingness and a sense of belongingness. And recently, some of that work has been challenged with the argument that his definition of feeling like you belong or that you're connected to an institution was not really looking at some of the issues that students of color or students from low socioeconomic backgrounds or students that might be single parents, et cetera. It wasn't necessarily considering some of the other challenges that students from diverse backgrounds might have. So, for example, how you define what makes you feel welcome and included may differ from the way that I define what makes me feel welcomed and included. And so I think the challenge with chief diversity officers is this concept of how do we figure out what makes our students feel welcome and connected and included. And I think you only get to that answer if you get the student narrative. So we can all go to conferences and we can come back with what we like to call our best practices. And I think one of the risks with best practices is it might have been best over there or in that state or in that community, which might be way smaller than your community or maybe dealing with different challenges. I think the real challenge is how do I go and hear about promising practices and then come back to my institution and figure out if there's a way to make that fit here. So I think this is a place where the chief diversity officer can help the college really hear the student narrative and hear what it takes. So if I'm a student of color, I may not be comfortable asking for directions to a classroom in the early weeks of the semester. If I have issues that have made me believe that asking questions makes me look inferior or stupid, if I already know, I've been experienced some stereotype threat through my K through 12 experience, I may not ask you just because you're wearing a button that says ask me or you're wearing the college ID. We may need to be more proactive. We may need to be available to students in the first couple of weeks of classes. And we may need to walk up to students and say, can I help you with something? Or, you look like, where are you heading? What class are you going to? And be proactive. That might be what makes it feel welcoming as opposed to, well, we had signs up. Well, we were available. Well, we had our buttons on. All they had to do was ask. I think oftentimes as CDOs, we hear that comment. All they had to do was ask, and we're not honoring the fact that everyone doesn't ask in the same ways and everybody doesn't feel welcome in the same ways. I heard my president say something today. The one thing about this work as a chief diversity officer is you do this work in public. When you're a faculty member, right, you can do that work pretty much in private. You go in your classroom, you and your students and whoever, it's Vegas. But this work, you really do it in public. So people are watching you as a chief diversity officer. How are you creating a sense of welcomeness and inclusion amongst your colleagues? How are you creating that on campus for the employees? What are you doing to signify to students that they're welcome and they should be included? So folks are watching you in that role. And it's, I think, your responsibility to help the campus understand how we can be more responsive to our student body simply by hearing what they have to say.
I agree with everything Michele said, and not only are you always in the public on campus, you're also in the public in your community, particularly at the community college level. And so there is I think sometimes a greater sense of responsibility and accountability in this emerging role of the CDO at the two-year college, because people always expect you to be on and be able to address the particular issues and needs of community college students. And again, that oftentimes extends beyond the traditional, work week or when the students are on campus to take classes. And even when they take classes, it looks dramatically different at the community college level than the four-year level.
Yeah.
They could be taking classes 24/7. They could be taking classes in the evening. They could be taking classes in the weekends. They could be taking classes at different site locations other than the main campus. And so, I think that whole sense of fostering community and belonging not only happens on campus, but it also has to take place in the community as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in what ways should, or I guess both of you in your roles as chief diversity officers, like how have you, I guess, fostered that role of like diversity, equity, inclusion, I guess on campuses and off campuses?
The first thing that I noticed when I first became a chief diversity officer, it was at Anne Arundel Community College, which is one of the larger community colleges in the country. The total enrollment of close to 50,000 students. That's credit and non-credit. It had main campus and then 4 other various site locations, if you will. And so the work of diversity, equity, inclusion there was large, and it was a one-person startup when they hired me as the inaugural chief diversity officer. And so understanding the particular needs of community college students, for me, sense of building that community, I chose to focus on looking at a CDO from the perspective of a community outreach and engagement officer. And so that was looking at developing collaborative relationships, not only on campus with faculty and staff and the various affinity groups, our student clubs and organizations, student government, but also a number of human and social service and leadership and civic engagement organizations in the community, and looking at tying some of our major employers in terms of the student employee experience to growing industries. It was important that I developed relationships with some of those key leaders in those industries, working with various, again, religious groups and organizations, social service agencies. Obviously, again, the needs of community college students, particular populations, they need services outside of the classroom. And some of those services, the community college is not equipped to provide them with, but connecting students to resources in their own community was vitally important to their completion and success. And so whether it was with the Community Action Agency, whether it was with leadership programs or working with some of our, I would say, mentoring groups and programs that were out in the community, the Boys and Girls Club, the YWCA, they all have resources and information to share with students and can engage students in ways that aren't always even appropriate, I think, for the community college employees to do that with. So that's kind of the approach that I took in terms of looking at building a sense of community and a sense of belonging, that there is kind of a seamless transition for students in their backyard, whether they were on our campus or whether they were at home or down the road at various agencies or organizations.
Chaddrick, I think that James makes a really good point about this sense of building community, this idea of creating connections and being a connector, because I think that's a really important role for the Chief Diversity Officer. So as the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at our institution, I really had more of that employee-facing, that employee officer role. And so one of the things that I did in that role was to try to model what inclusion and connection and welcomeness felt like. So in the work as a Chief Diversity Officer, this might be surprising, but when new employees would start and they'd get approved through the board, or someone would get a promotion, or someone would get a new job change, nobody ever sent anybody a note. So my office literally did handwritten card notes to anybody who was being promoted, and I got the information from our board packet. So I could tell when the Board of Trustees approved somebody that was a new hire or what have you, and as a new employee, you received a note from my office, myself and my admin would sign off on it. And so the beginning of your time at the college was, oh, who is this Office of Diversity and Inclusion? And somebody cares that I'm here, or somebody cares that I got promoted. They bothered to congratulate me, and they actually signed it with real handwriting. It wasn't an email. So those little personal touches were the things that became synonymous with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. There's a new employee reception that's sponsored twice a year. So we do kind of a rotating. The first 6 months that you're here, there's a special reception. It's held in the afternoon. You're invited, your supervisor encourages you to come, and senior leadership is there. Often new employees have no idea who sits on president's cabinet, who these people are. So how could you possibly ever move up or become an integral part of the organization if you don't fully understand the organization? So a very unintimidating way of bringing people together. I also, folks know that me personally on this campus, I often invite new employees to join me for lunch in our student dining room. So it gives them an opportunity to see what our students are doing. It's relatively cost effective for me, and just again an opportunity for me to connect with people, find out who they are, what talents and skills they bring to the organization. And then when it's time to create intergroup dialogues, I'm looking for facilitators. I know people because I know them personally. I've connected with them that I can reach out to serve in these facilitator roles. When folks know that they need to file an issue of bias, they're more comfortable coming to me. They've met me in a much less threatening and stressful environment. So now they feel comfortable having a conversation with me. Putting posters up that talk about being a welcoming environment and not mandating them for everybody, but having people say, I want that poster or that t-shirt that says you're welcome, you're safe here in various language. So people have to kind of take some action to be a part of this inclusion movement. I found that those things were really helpful. And as I did that from the office for other employees, we began to see employees mirroring that for the students that they were welcoming in or that they were teaching in their classroom. So it's a real small kind of ticking away at the mountain, but it gets you there little by little. I think you have to, as a chief diversity officer, not only have thick skin and have lots of good friends, but you also have to be willing to be patient for the work to take impact in some cases. Yeah. And that's challenging, but I think it's necessary. That speed of trust that James talked about, that's vital if you're going to be successful at this work.
Tune in for the second episode of this podcast, where Chaddrick Gallaway continues to explore the role of Chief Diversity Officers in higher education and a call to action with James Felton III and Michele Smith. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and for your contributions to educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.